So, hi guys, it's International Master Alex Astaneh here, and I'm going to be showing you in this introductory video, I'm just going to be showing you all of the lines that we're going to be covering, all the variations that we're going to be looking at in this course. Now, the first thing I want to say to you is the course is not going to be comprehensive in the sense that every single line is examined because basically time would not allow it. If we're, let's say, a very, very strong grandmaster, we might spend upwards of 200 hours looking at Caro-Kann theory alone. So we have some time constraints. We're not going to be covering absolutely everything, but we are certainly going to be covering the main lines in all of the variations, and then sometimes also some sidelines. So it won't be a complete exhaustive coverage, but it will, if you're a brand new beginner to the Caro-Kann, or if you have some experience in the Caro-Kann but want to learn some new ideas, then I'm sure it will be very helpful for you to make progress and to understand the Caro-Kann a little bit better. Now, let's actually show one by one the variations we're going to be covering. First of all, the Caro-Kann is an opening that takes place on the board after move 1. And this is something that makes it such a great opening choice because unlike with other openings, we actually get the Caro-Kann immediately every single time that white plays one e4. So it's an opening you get to play a lot of the time. Now, once we have this position, white has many different possibilities. The major move that white plays is the move pawn to d4. And black's idea with the Caro-Kann is that unlike, for example, in the Scandinavian, which is the move pawn to d5 first, white would capture the pawn, and now black captures here on d5, but his queen is a little bit vulnerable. Instead, in the Caro-Kann, what black does is he spends an extra move playing pawn to c6, and his intention is to play the pawn to d5, after which, if white captures this pawn, black will capture back and keep a pawn in the center. So it's quite an ambitious opening where black is hoping to have a nice control of the center, a nice grip on the center. So let's go back and let's see after e4, c6, what white usually does is he proceeds to establish a second pawn in the center, and now black plays pawn to d5. From here, white has a few different options. The first option that we're going to be looking at is the classical variation. White can play the move knight to c3 or the move knight to d2, and we will get to the classical against both of these options. Because what we will do is we will capture the pawn on e4, and after knight takes e4, it doesn't matter to us whether the knight has traveled via c3 to e4 or via d2 to e4. The second option that we're going to be looking at is if white, rather than defending his pawn on e4, the so-called classical variation, white pushes the pawn forward. And this is unsurprisingly called the advance variation. In this case, we're going to be focusing on the main line of the advance variation, which is the short variation, which involves a quick knight f3 and bishop to e2. So we'll check that out in great depth later on. After this, we have the exchange variation. The names are rather predictable so far. The exchange variation, the advance variation is when you advance the e-pawn. The exchange variation is when you exchange the e-pawn for the d-pawn. And here, white has a variety of options. We'll be focusing on the main line that starts with bishop to d3. And we'll talk quite a bit about this structure where white, we can see, has 4 pawns on the queen side and 3 on the king side, and black has 2 pawns on the queen side and 5 on the king side. It's like a reverse Carlsbad structure for those of you who are familiar with the Carlsbad structure. Besides this, we also have this move f3, which simply aims to support white's central pawns on e4 and d4, and this is known as the fantasy variation of the Caro-Kann. Finally, we go to positions where we can examine possibilities besides this move d4. We will look at the move knight to c3. After knight c3, black will play the same move. d5 is pretty much always played by black on the second move. And here white plays knight f3, again back to rather easy to remember names, this is known as the two knights variation of the Caro-Kann. And white simply is aiming for fast development and to maintain the support of the pawn just with his queen's knight. This is quite a tricky line, and here the main line is bishop to g4, but I will be recommending a very trendy move in recent years, knight f6, which I myself have played in tournaments on a handful of occasions. Besides the two knights, we can also examine a rare option, which is the move pawn to d3, and this is known as the Breyer variation of the Caro-Kann. After d5, white will put his knight to d2 to prevent an exchange of queens, and will build up the position slowly, a little bit in some cases like a King's Indian attack. So we'll take a look at how to deal with this, but we're going to be following principled chess play, grabbing some more control of the center, seeing as in this case, white does not have a pawn on e5, does not have a pawn on d4, and does not have a knight on f3. So in the absence of controlling the e5 square, we're just going to grab that square ourselves. Finally, we also, on move 2, white can play this move pawn to c4, anticipating the move d5. And after d5, white can take the pawn on d5, and after a series of exchanges, we reach a position known as the accelerated Panov variation. The idea is that if black captures the pawn on d5 with his queen, white can play knight c3 and gain fast development and play an isolated queen's pawn position for those of you who are familiar with so-called IQP positions. Black, therefore, it's recommended play knight f6, threatening to capture the pawn with his knight instead. And here there are many options for white, so we will consider these in a separate video. The final option is the Panov-Botvinnik, which can be reached via two different move orders. You can reach it via the exchange move order, where it goes like this: pawn takes, and now pawn to c4. Or you can also reach it via the move order of the accelerated Panov, which we just took a look at: e4, c6, c4, d5, pawn takes d5, pawn takes d5, and now pawn to d4. These positions are very dynamic. They are positions where white typically, when these pawns are removed, white typically ends up with an isolated queen's pawn, but that gives him more space and more attacking possibilities. In fact, at chessfactor.com, we have some material with isolated queen's pawn positions, how to play them both as white and as black. So feel free to reference that if you want to touch up your strategic play in IQP positions. But for the focus of this particular series, the focus is going to be on the Caro-Kann theory, more so than how to play IQP positions generally. So that's it as far as this introductory video goes. I've presented to you an overview and a list of all the different variations we'll be looking at. Hopefully you like the sound of it, you like the early moves in each variation, and you'd like to explore them further. And if you would, then please come and join me for an in-depth look where we will be beginning in the next video with the classical variation of the Caro-Kann. So I hope to see you then.